Hey everyone, welcome back to the YOUnify podcast. If you're new here, I'm Brandyn Keating, co-founder and CEO of YOUnify, a nonprofit organization helping you flourish and thrive, and I'm also the host of our podcast. I'm so excited today to have Kate O'Neill here with us. She calls herself the Tech Humanist, and she's earned it. She was one of the first 100 employees at Netflix, built Toshiba America's first intranet, and founded one of the earliest digital strategy and analytics agencies. Today, she advises organizations from Google and IBM to the United Nations on how to make technology decisions that are both effective and human-friendly. Boy, do we need that. She's the author of 4 books, the most recent being What Matters Next, a leader's guide to making human-friendly tech decisions in a world that's moving too fast, recognized by Thinkers 50 as one of the top 10 best new management books of 2025. She's been on the BBC, NPR, World Government Summit, and invited to the United Nations AI Advisory Board meetings. Her TEDx talk is called We Cannot Leave Meaning Up to the Machines. Kate, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Brandyn. It's a delight to be here. And thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Absolutely. So, Kate, you've had this incredible career that spans some of the most pivotal moments in the digital age. Early Netflix, early internet, the rise of analytics and AI. Looking back, was there a moment when you realized that the question you were most interested in wasn't what can technology do, but what should we do with technology?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, especially to kick off with. I feel like I'm very fortunate that my career has given me what feels like a front row seat to where things are headed, and that the patterns of technology sort of show up in different ways and how they get used at scale. So over the years, I noticed that people would latch on to certain ideas that seem to explain our relationship with technology, but that those ideas would quickly stop being enough to explain them. Like, for example, in the early 2000s, I remember I wish I knew who, someone coined the line, if you're not paying, you are the product.
Oh.
And that was, incredibly sharp insight at the time, but it became inadequate really fast. And people still quote it to this day, but it doesn't account for the fact that you could be paying and still be the product.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't account for the fact that you can be swept into the data set, even if you're not using a service at all, just by moving through the world, generating data that gets used to monetize experiences and track and surveil behavior for commercial ends. So to me, what that pointed to, just kind of observing this pattern, was that there were 2 needs. One was clearer frameworks that help people understand what's happening.
Yes.
And a second thing was just a vigilant eye on how these effects play out at scale.
Yeah, well, I think I can say for myself, and I can imagine all of our listeners and viewers will be too, very grateful for your vigilant eye. And
Thank you.
You call yourself the Tech Humanist. What does that mean to you, and why did you feel that framing was needed? What was missing from the conversation that made you want to coin that name?
Well, I had spent so much of my early career in Silicon Valley, and one thing I noticed was that Silicon Valley and other tech-centric business communities worldwide, that there's this tendency to default to techno-solutionism. People get really excited about tech is going to save the world.
Yeah.
And that default is very true now, but it has actually been building for decades. And it worried me when I started to really clock that pattern, because I could see how much potential technology has, of course, to solve human problems at scale, but it doesn't do that solving on its own. It only sort of delivers on the promise of that solution when technology is applied with intention, with strategy, with clarity, and most importantly, I think with alignment between what business objectives you're trying to solve for and what human outcomes that you're going to have out of how you apply the technology. So I wanted to see the emphasis shift toward using technology to scale that alignment rather than simply scaling business objectives with no regard for the human outcomes downstream.
Yeah, so brilliant and so necessary. I think a lot of people are feeling really nervous about the stream outcomes
Yeah.
right now. Definitely want to dig more into your incredible professional work. But before we do that, I'm curious to know about young Kate. So you have, sort of been on the cutting edge of technology and how we can make it more human centered. What was young Kate like, and how did you become this person focused on these things and these big
There's this
questions?
no, it's really such a great question. I tell this story, I think, in What Matters Next, which, by the way, I'll do a little plug here.
Yes, what
Here's the
matters
book.
next?
I think I tell this story in What Matters Next, and it sounds apocryphal. It sounds like something that I've made up, but it actually is true that when I was in first grade, I won 2 statewide first place awards, which were for a young author competition and
Mhm.
for a young programmer competition.
What?
So I tell you this to tell you that I've always been this way. This is like,
The
I've always
seeds
been the
were
person.
there. Yeah.
Yeah. I always was fascinated by programming and technology, by computers, as I think we just called them back then. And then I've also always been interested in writing and communicating and kind
Yeah.
of getting what I could understand back then as big ideas down. I've also always been a language nerd. I study over 30 languages now and have been just
30.
fascinated with languages my whole life. Yeah. So there's a lot of connective tissue in those early years that, took a lot of years of practice in technology to sort of build the frameworks that they could connect through. But it feels really gratifying to be at a place where I can see those dots connect.
Incredible. Yeah. And so, what maybe for somebody who knows you through your writing or your speaking, your professional life, what might someone be surprised to learn about you? Is there a secret talent, a fun fact? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the 30 languages might be the thing.
That's a lot of languages.
It is, and it sounds excessive, but I really love a lot of, first of all, I love the fact that they're practical. Like
Yeah.
you never don't have a use for a language. I mean, unless it's Klingon, but then you still might if you are someone who goes to like science fiction conventions
Yeah.
and you'll nerd out with the other people who speak Klingon. But for me, there's something, first of all, it is uniquely human, right? Like we're the ones creating these languages and we're the ones that have so many of them. And that's really fascinating to me. But I also, and this kind of ties into the TEDx talk you mentioned in my intro, there's also this insight that I had when I was 7 years old. And this is how I opened the talk, that 7 years old, sitting on a library floor, holding a Spanish language instruction book in my hands. And when I'm holding this book, I see the word libro and I'm like, oh, libro is book. Wait, book is book. Libro is book. What? And like my little brain just fries and I go like, oh, that means that the actual book is separate from whatever we call it.
Yeah.
And that was such a profound insight for little 7-year-old Kate. But it also was the very first insight I can remember having and began this like lifelong obsession with insights. So there's a lot of layers to that story.
Yeah, well, and that obsession is definitely a clear through line in your work as well. And so coming back to your TED Talk, which again is called We Cannot Leave Meaning Up to Machines, very resonant with me, and I'm sure many people. That is a pretty striking claim. And could you unpack for folks a little bit, what is the risk if we do? What if we do leave meaning up to machines?
Yeah, good question. I feel like there's a line in that talk that I am particularly proud of and that gets quoted back to me a lot, which is we're confusing linguistic likelihood for lived experiences. And that is because there's something about generative AI and specifically large language models have this ability to produce language really fluently. And they're really compelling and convincing in how they construct these utterances, these interactions. And we can be fooled into imagining that we're communicating with like other beings, with like our equals, or in some cases, we might even sense that they're like our superiors. And that's really dangerous, both from a mental health standpoint. We certainly have many examples of people becoming convinced that the chatbot that they're interacting with, like, thinks and feels and cares about them and is, somebody that they should be, listening to the advice of, um, as opposed to it simply being a predictive algorithm that is saying the most likely next set of words. And that's kind of the point, that like what we need to be doing is reclaiming that understanding that what the tool is doing is prediction. And what we need to do is purpose. We need to be thinking about what it means to decide what matters. And it's, no coincidence that that ties into the title of my book. What matters next is a reference to meaning. It is a reference to that central idea of, at every level that we think about meaning, which is a very human construct, it is always about what matters. And we're the only ones who can do that in a way that's relevant to our lives and our societies. We cannot assume that machines can ever have an understanding of how we would prioritize those kinds of things.
Yeah, and coming back to the book, I'm going to say the whole title again, because it's such a great title. And please do show folks while I'm saying this title. It's What Matters Next, A Leader's Guide to Making Human-Friendly Tech Decisions in a World That's Moving Too Fast. Super resonant as well. I think we can all feel that viscerally. And so what is the central problem that the book is trying to solve?
Yeah, I think the main thing, if you were to boil it down to one word, it is acceleration. Because I think that the sense of acceleration that people feel, and particularly leaders, this is definitely a leadership book, but leaders can be anyone. I think, you and I share that philosophy.
Yeah, we do.
So leaders in a position of decision making, which again can be anyone, I think the tendency is when things feel accelerating, when we feel like, oh no, things are moving so fast and they're only moving faster, that makes our decision making compressed and extreme. And it means that what we tend to do is either overreact toward making increasingly short-sighted decisions, or overreact to making increasingly long-range decisions that don't take into account what needs to happen in the short term. So it's an attempt to use time, like a clearer sense of time, to put that into perspective and help people also develop a better learning process before going into those decisions. So asking better questions, gathering better insights, developing better foresight. And so over time, as people use this process, they're becoming increasingly wise. That's one thing that, I think the book does really promote the idea of, but using better decision-making, using better thinking, and getting clearer in the way you're making those decisions.
You argue in the book, and kind of previewed a few minutes ago, that bad tech decisions often happen not because leaders lack the will to do the right thing, but because they lack the right framework. Can you share a little bit about what that framework looks like and what the core of your approach is?
Yeah, the core model in the book is called the Now Next Continuum, and it is really just a timeline, but it is a way of recognizing that as we sort of stand in the present and look toward the past, we have the benefit of hindsight, but we're looking toward things that are known. Like we're looking toward what we can know and what we can ask about and gather facts about. And it's also what we know about those things we know because they were once what mattered to us, right? Like we put metrics in place. We put monitoring in place to gather data about these things. What that should do for us is allow us to kind of flip it around and look toward the future and go like, okay, what is likely to matter in the future? What could we predict might be something that we would want to know about at this point, like a day from now, a month from now, a year from now, 10 years from now? And it gets harder, obviously, the farther out you look, but it really helps, I think, and a lot of my readers have confirmed with me that it really helps to put it in that context of saying, look, if you look toward the past and then you sort of flip it toward the future, it really helps you understand what 5 years looks like, right? Like what a year looks like. And in that context of acceleration, a year might feel more compressed ahead of us than it does behind us. I get that. But it at least still gives us some context for what that time frame should look and feel like and the kinds of decisions we will need to be making over that horizon.
And I wonder if there's like a concrete example that you could walk us through that sort of could illustrate for folks how a leader actually uses that lens in practice.
Yeah, it's one of the things I really like about the future side of the now next continuum is that I show in my keynotes that you can zoom in on it, and what's actually happening is that you're asking a bunch of scenario questions, a bunch of what if questions. And so imagine that you're someone who's making decisions about driverless cars and the infrastructure to support driverless cars. And you might be asking like, well, is it likely that in 5 years to 10 years time, we're going to be in a place where, autonomous vehicles can roam freely through the streets of New York City or LA or wherever? And what are going to be the barriers preventing more of that? So you ask, the meaningful questions like about safety. You ask questions about infrastructure, and you ask questions about, people's resistance and emotional state, relative to these things, about, local policy and that sort of thing. But you start being able to plot out, the most likely thing that's going to happen relative to any given question. You also get to be able to say what your most preferred outcome is. So you can sort of have that as like, there's what you want to have happen, and here's what's most likely to happen. And your job becomes to decide how to close that gap, but not close it in a way that's about bringing your preferred outcome down to the most probable, because that's settling for whatever the future is already going to do in most likelihood. What you're trying to do is steer the outcomes of the future. You're trying to move the most probable to your most preferred. And so that brings with it the questions like, what are the next decisions you need to make? What are the next actions that you need to take to start iterating your way toward moving the future in the direction you most want it to happen?
Very interesting. Very resonant with political campaign planning, actually.
Oh, yeah, I would
Yeah.
imagine.
Yeah. So the book also includes a leadership assessment to help people understand their decision-making style. What are the different styles you've identified, and what do leaders most often discover about themselves when they take the assessment?
Yeah, we did this study and put this model together, and I like that there's 4 default settings that we identify in the assessment. It's immediate focus, which is the more now heavy. It's future focused, which is a more next heavy view. It's balanced, or it's innovative. And none of these are wrong, but each shows a bias in how we relate to, time, risk, and responsibility. So the assessment points out, where it looks like you skew, what your attributes are, like what's good about that, and then what you're trading off basically in under acceleration, and offers growth suggestions for how you can do better. Like, for example, I tend to be a future focused, like next heavy, which sounds good on some level, but it's vision driven. But you can miss what people need right now in order to sustain the momentum that they need. So a growth opportunity for me as a decision maker is often to translate, big picture vision into, more like human scaled steps for people, for my team, for the collaborators I work with.
Love that. And there's a concept in the book about encoding human-centric values into technologies. What does that mean concretely? How do we turn that from a good idea into something we can actually do?
Yeah, and I think this is not a one size fits all, but I am very concrete and very specific about meaning and purpose being at this kind of meta level of, what is a core human focus. Like, I think across all of humanity, this is a very centrally human condition.
Absolutely.
But, different groups, different communities, different, kind of contingency or I'm like drawing a blank on the word I'm looking for, but communities, we'll go with
Yeah.
communities. Stakeholder groups are going to have different priorities for how they show
Mhm.
up. And this is one of the reasons why diversity and inclusion matters so much, in any context, in corporate, in, sort of city planning or whatever, but to understand what it is that different stakeholders need from the solutions that you're trying to roll out. I
Mhm.
think that's what it means to think about human-centric values. It's really, how are you solving for the problems of the people who are going to be, using the platform, the tool, the solution, and the people who are not going to be using it, who are downstream from that solution or
Yeah.
or proposal.
Yeah, and
So
experiencing the ripple effects.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So like Airbnb is an example of that, right? Like,
Mhm.
so thinking about how Airbnb seems like such a great idea, and it is, except that, the sort of unintended consequences of Airbnb are as we are all, I'm sure,
Yeah.
familiar with, the pricing out of people out of neighborhoods where, they're at the cusp of gentrification, and people are able to buy up a lot of, 1 and 2 bedroom apartments or homes and make them unaffordable to people who were otherwise living there, and make that neighborhood also untenable because it becomes this kind of floater community of short-lived people, or just short-term visitors, as opposed to a real community of residents who are invested in their neighborhood and care about the direction of the neighborhood.
Yeah. Um, so you have also been, as I mentioned at the top, invited to United Nations AI advisory body meetings. And I'm curious about when you're in a room shaping global AI governance conversations, what are the things that most concern you and what is giving you hope?
Well, the hope is easy. The hope is coming from the fact that these conversations are happening at all, and that
Mhm.
they're happening with a lot of people in the room who are compassionate and concerned, and, showing up with great intention and drive. That's wonderful, and that's always inspiring. I think, the concern is number one, do we have the right and the widest variety of stakeholders in the room who do represent those varying interests, and who could, better represent things that we might be overlooking in consideration.
Mhm.
um, Another concern is, are we, in that process of bringing a lot of stakeholders into the room, you, as I'm sure you completely know from the work you do, you always kind of have that trade-off of the more people you've involved, the slower the process becomes, the harder it becomes to kind of wade through the discrepancies of different people's lived experiences, and give platform and airtime to people to make sure that those ideas do surface, and that you're engaging with the diversity of ideas in the room. But that takes time. And I think with technology in particular, with AI in particular, you're really dealing with situations where, time is of the essence, and we are woefully behind, at every level of governance, in addressing the urgency of AI protections, and protections that fall under the umbrella term of AI, since after all, I think your audience probably is sophisticated enough to know this. Artificial intelligence is a marketing umbrella term for a wide array of technologies. And, generative AI like ChatGPT, large language models like ChatGPT, are really only one of those technology types. There's so many other things. If you use, Netflix and get movie recommendations, or Amazon and get recommendations, or whatever, that's a long standing form of algorithmic intelligence of a sort. Anyway, all of these different types of technologies have been around for a while, and they're growing, and they're growing really fast. And the impacts of them are growing. And I worry that um, we're not having rigorous enough and deep enough conversations
Mm.
about where they need to be governed,
Yeah.
and rolling that out.
Yeah. Um, I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier, which is also in your book. The idea that meaning and purpose are fundamental to human experience, which of course um, is a core thread through all of our leadership for flourishing work. and is one of the global flourishing goals. Um, you sort of share that this belief is informed not just by your career, but also by your personal experiences with profound loss. Would you be willing to share a little bit about how that's shaped the way that you think about how technology, excuse me, what technology can and can't do for us?
Yeah, thanks for asking that in a compassionate way. To be explicit, so I lost my husband, my first husband, to suicide in 2012, and 7 years prior to that, I had lost my dad to cancer. And so my one of my first books, you mentioned in the intro, I've written 4 books. Those are the technology and business books. I've actually also written a couple of others, and one of them is a memoir called Surviving Death,
Mm,
which sort of looks at the common threads of losing my dad to cancer and my husband to suicide, but also just at grief and loss as human experiences, and
mm,
the counterpoint to those, which are the opportunities for joy and loss and purpose that sort of open up
mm,
when you sort of allow yourself to experience all of it fully. At least for me, and obviously I'm not presupposing that everyone experiences it the same way. But for me, it was, I had already a pretty excited focus on meaning and purpose. It was something that I had been fascinated with all my life. But with the loss of these two really, really important people to
mm,
me, it really deepened my appreciation for why purpose is such an important part, and why meaning is such an important part of the human experience, and why I think just because I work in technology and have worked in technology, that's the facet of it that, kind of I wanted to examine. But also because more and more, I think we presume, and by we, I mean technology entrepreneurs, business leaders who use technology, we presume that we can, sort of insert technology in a way that's going to, replace some kind of meaningful experience, or supplant it, or enhance it. And I really
mm,
think there's huge opportunities to enhance it. I'm a big advocate for enhancing meaning and purpose through technology. I think it requires so much care and
mm.
so much caution,
Yeah.
and a wise, holistic perspective overall. And I don't see that, showing up that way very often. So that it does inform, my overall work, my overall viewpoint. And yeah, it is something that's always there. It's always core to how I'm thinking about
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So, for a leader listening or watching to this podcast who feels overwhelmed, who's in organizations where technology decisions are moving faster than anybody's ability to think them through, what do you feel like
this.
the most important first step is? Like, what is just one thing that, and maybe even to broaden a little further, for anybody who's feeling overwhelmed by the pace of technology right now, what's just one thing they could do right after this podcast ends, that you might recommend?
Yeah, I think it's implicit in the title, What Matters Next. It's because I think the next action, the next step is so
Mhm.
important. We don't have to have the full map in front of us. You don't have to have all the answers, all the solutions. It helps if you can try to think about the full map, but it also matters that you're making that next step or taking that next action as intentionally as you possibly can, right? Like, what is the clarity I can bring to this next action? What is the purpose I can bring to this next action? And then embrace that process as an iterative process, as one that you're going to do again on Tuesday and again on Wednesday, right? You're going to be thinking on a regular basis, if you approach this way, of the next action and the next decision as a form of iteration, not as like weak-willed, sort of passivity, but iteration as a way to test and experiment and stay current and not overcommit to something that you can't deliver on when things change completely, but just to be able to get us to the next place. But doing that, again, with as much clarity and foresight as you possibly can. That's a good practice for anyone, I think, to really just commit to moving themselves forward just a little bit.
I love that. And we are just about to the end of our time, but I was absolutely flown by. But I want to make sure that you can share at least just a little bit, maybe a little bit of an appetizer about strategic optimism as a framework, what it is and why it's a strategic posture rather than just a feeling.
Yeah, there's a thing about optimism that is really powerful, and that is that it's a very generative way to think about the future. But it is also, I think it gets a bad rap for being out of touch with reality. And the way to balance that, I think, is by bringing a rigorous approach to strategy to it, by having an understanding of what could go wrong, what are the risks and harms that come with trying to do this thing you're trying to do. So you manage those. That's the strategy part. You're keeping an eye on the risks and harms, and you are absolutely disciplined about managing those. All the while, though, you're articulating the most hopeful vision of the future you possibly can. Like, what could we do? What could we possibly do? Could we, for example, unify people in communities and, rebuild trust and have people be able to, kind of get past bipartisanship and be able to speak each other's language again? Maybe. So let's work toward that hopeful vision while we manage the risks and harms over here. So it's like never taking your eye off of the best possible outcome you could possibly work toward and managing those risks along the way.
Love that. Disciplined hopefulness. Beautiful.
Yes.
And what's next for you? How would you most like people to connect with you? How can folks who are inspired access your work? Obviously, everybody should buy the book, and we will have the link for that in the description.
Book? This book?
That book, there it is. What Matters Next. Anything else you'd like to share with people about what's next and what you'd like to invite them into?
Yeah. People can always follow KO Insights, which is my company. It is mostly speaking, advisory, and so on. I also have a podcast myself, which Brandyn is a guest on, coming up on an episode very soon here, called The Tech Humanist Show. And you can also find me on LinkedIn, Kate O'Neill. If you search for Kate O'Neill, the Tech Humanist, you will find me all over the place. And I would love to hear from folks about what resonated during this conversation.
Amazing. So again, we'll have all the links below in the description for those of you finding this on YouTube and across our socials as well, so that you can connect with Kate, get the book. We also have the links for our Leadership for Flourishing book, and to get involved with the Write the Future campaign, where you can get together with folks in your local community, imagine the hopeful future, and make concrete plans to get there. So thanks everybody for joining. Thank you so much, Kate. Incredible to hear from you. We'll definitely have to have you back. There's so much more to dig into.
I'd love it, Brandyn. Thank you.
Amazing. And we'll see you next time. So what else is on for your day, Kate?
I am catching up from Joshua Tree, but I'm excited because I was working on outlining my new book in Joshua Tree, but not quite ready to talk in detail about it.